Perfect. Okay, so just to recap, now that I'm recording, students have asked about a study guide and whether we're going to have one for the test. Dr. Otteson has talked about creating one, and she should be posting it by Monday or Tuesday. You should be seeing it sometime next week. Keep in mind, you do have 3 days to take the test. In fact, let me pull up the slide here. So the test is going to be open on Friday at 12 p.m. and it's going to stay open until Sunday at 12 p.m. So just keep that in mind on Canvas. It closes at 12 p.m. So don't put it off until midnight on Sunday because it will probably be closed by then. I believe it's 50 minutes timed. So you have the 3 days to take it, but once you start the test, you only have 50 minutes. So if you start the test, you can't leave it and come back to it. So I'm not sure about Jordan in the 3 p.m. session, but so you guys are all aware, I hold office hours on Tuesdays from 1:30 to 3 p.m. And so, please feel free to set up an appointment with me. I only can do appointments since, because of COVID, I don't have an office to go to. But if you send me an email and say, hey, I want to meet up, I'd be happy to talk about some questions about the test or any questions you have. And then Dr. Otteson also holds office hours on Monday and Wednesday from 2 to 3. So yeah, definitely take advantage. I always love to talk about, these topics, and I'm certainly no expert. Dr. Otteson is definitely well knowledge and knows a lot of history about the topics that we've talked about. And so he would certainly be a great resource, far better than I would be. But if you guys have questions for me, I can always, you guys can always ask and access me. I'm happy to answer. And then just real quick too, just because it's this weekend, the Most We Could Do presentation is due this upcoming Saturday. And so here to post a video, I hope you guys have been able to work on those so far. If you have questions about the aspects of the assignment, it's all pretty laid out in the syllabus. So read through that and then just let Dr. Otteson and I know if you have any specific questions. One thing I want to make sure is for both classes, you're going to be required to submit your votes by the end of the weekend. So you email that to your TA. Please do that. That's actually a huge part of your grade. We had a lot of students who didn't do that, and I think it's like 5% of the grade of the assignment or of your total grade. So it's as simple as just sending your votes. So don't forget to do that. You can just email it over to me and I'll record that. Does anyone have questions about the test or about the assignment?
We just post the videos as an announcement in our discussion group, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would work. You should, and I might actually be able to share with you guys. Oh, sorry. Let me show you what it would probably look like on your screen. So under your groups, you should have a group, your own group for the social ethics class. These are all my groups for my class. But once you click on that group, and then there should be a discussion page. The discussion is, I think, where you're supposed to post it. But I think if you post it as an announcement because you can't find it anywhere else, that would be fine too. But I would look for that discussion first to post it there. There you go. Sorry, chat box was in the way. Okay, any other questions about that submission? Yeah, the reason behind why you would want it on your discussion board is it allows students to see all of them at once. And so, again, they'll be able to see it as an announcement. So I think either way would be fine. But if you can find the discussion board, which should just be under that groups tab, that's where I would submit it. Okay, perfect. Well, we will get started on what I had prepared. Again, as we're going through this, if you have questions that you'd prefer to talk about, especially questions about the topics, please just, don't wait for me to stop talking, just jump in. I'll do as best as I can to pause and to leave some time for questions. but I'm doing a little bit of a different approach to the readings that we had and the topics that we had from our last SI session. You know, in the beginning of our lesson, in regards to torture, Dr. Otteson highlighted these 3 main points, and these are crucial. You know, as you're thinking about what is going to be on the test, or what kind of material is most important for me to take from the readings and from the classes, I want you to think about these 3 questions. So an ethical argument would probably go as follows. You know, you need to first ask yourself, what is the ethical position, or what is the position this person is taking in regards to this issue? Are they for it, or are they against it? Do they have specific justifications for why they would be for it? So, for example, you know, Mark Bowden, who we'll talk about, said that torture it's not impermissible, but it should always be illegal. And so that's not necessarily a black or white, yeah, torture is good or torture is bad. He's saying, you know, he has a very, very specific stance on what he thinks about torture. And so think about that when you think about the positions. If you can understand what they're trying to argue, that will help you get a pretty broad and good idea of what the arguments are going to be about. And so the next point is then, why does this person believe or do what they do? So some examples: what evidence do they give? What reasons do they give? What arguments do they give that supports their position? And then that leads into the last point: how do the reasons support their position? So I guess a very common logical structure or argument structure in philosophy, if A and B, then C. And so if it's somebody, I guess just for example, again with the Mark Bowden, if we know somebody who has critical information that can save thousands of lives, we also know that if we were to torture them, we can get that information, then in those specific circumstances, torture would be okay. That would probably be like a position that Mark Bowden would take. That's definitely not my position. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that's the kind of arguments that that we're looking for in the readings and in the figures that we're reading. So does anyone have questions about that? Because I think that's kind of how we're going to approach each of the characters that we've read. Okay, so going back to about a week ago, we discussed foreign intervention. So starting with foreign intervention, the cons for foreign intervention. Stephen Kinzer was one of the main characters that we talked about who opposes foreign intervention, who has opposed specific US foreign intervention in the past in Latin America, as well as in the Middle East. He thinks in his first, his argument or his view is that US foreign intervention causes more problems than it solves. And then he gives some specific examples. Citizens of Honduras and El Salvador fled these countries because of violence and political instability. This instability was a direct cause of US foreign intervention in the 1980s. And so we talked about the border crisis that happened, here really recently under the Trump administration. The Trump administration wasn't allowing any of these refugees to come into the country, and they were coming in mass caravans. They were coming in huge quantities of people because they were fleeing from death squads. They were fleeing from just complete violence that was occurring. And it was, I guess, an argument that we talked about that Stephen probably would have said in this is, the Obama administration, or, this was a direct cause of US foreign intervention. These people are fleeing from violence because of something that we caused. We came in for very specific economic purposes, and it led the country in pretty much ruin. And that was one of his takes. In a little bit different situation and scenario was with what happened in Libya and Sudan. Our intervention in Libya and Sudan was more ideological. We went in, we overthrew Gaddafi. We wanted to provide more stability. essentially Gaddafi was a bad guy. Oops, sorry. Gaddafi did a lot of evil things. Osama bin Laden, another example of someone we overthrew. These weren't good people. They were doing horrible things. They were threats to the United States, as well as to their own people. However, and I think that the difference here is, we say, the intervention that we did in Honduras and El Salvador, it wasn't justified. It was pretty much completely for economic gain, for selfish purposes, and we led the country worse off than it was. In Libya and Sudan, we were trying to help the nation. We were kind of showing our power, and we went and overthrew Gaddafi. However, it still left the country far worse off than it was before. And so, after the overthrowing of Gaddafi, Stephen Kinzer basically said, the U.S. had absolutely no intentions of figuring out what they were going to do after the overthrow of Gaddafi. They were only concerned with overthrowing him. And because the U.S. had no plans of, how they were going to help Libya and these countries recoup and rebuild after the overthrow of Gaddafi, they shouldn't be doing it, because in our experience, we leave countries worse off than they were before, even though we're taking over these crooked leaders. Okay. Does anyone have questions about that? Okay. So in contrast, we have Robert Kaplan. We also talked about the Athenians, and this was in more of a pro-empire, a pro-foreign intervention. Robert Kaplan and the Athenians, they had two pretty different views on why empires in specific were beneficial, why they were needed, but nonetheless, they thought it was necessary in some circumstances to have intervention. So on the contrast from what Stephen Kinzer viewed, they supported the idea and encouraged the idea of empires and of essentially intervention into other countries if necessary. Some of the examples he gave, and I guess the main one he gives, is of the Ottoman Empire. Basically, after the Ottoman Empire fell, major wars in the Middle East persisted and continues today. Another example is the Soviet Empire would continue to dominate and would have dominated at the time if the US did not intervene. So this is from Kaplan. In 3 here, it says that the result of no empire equals chaos. Big or small empires have the power to keep small or minority nations from destroying each other. And then his most famous quote that we talked about in class was, "How much bad do you need to do before you can do good? It is better to dominate rather than to be dominated." So he encourages the idea of empires to keep stability, essentially. Under the circumstances of the Ottoman Empire, without an empire, or without the empire that existed amongst the Ottomans, once it was overthrown, there was a lot of corruptness. Essentially, there became instability between smaller nations and minority nations. And so because there wasn't a dominant power, they weren't able to bring control and stability within these smaller nations. And that's Kaplan's view on that. So again, it's important to understand Kaplan's view and why he specifically thinks empires would be necessary. He thinks that without empires at times, there could be chaos. And so he is encouraging stability. The Athenians have a much different approach. They say in the Millennium Dialogue that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So essentially, it's an idea or a form of survival of the fittest. The strong are created to dominate, and the weak are created to be dominated. And so, to support their argument, or some of the examples they give, is that they propose surrender by the Melians. The Athenians believe that they must conquer the Melians before Sparta does. They say, "Of the gods we believe, and of men we know that by a necessary law of their nature, they rule wherever they can." So this quote was in direct, I guess the context of this quote specifically is, as they're dialoguing with each other, the Athenians are justifying their reasons to dominate them. The Melians are trying to essentially beg for mercy. At this point, they ask, what would the gods think if you were to prey on us? And the Athenians' answer was, well, we're doing pretty much exactly what the gods are doing. The gods have always lived to dominate. The strong have always survived. The weak have always been dominated. That kind of falls to the final point there. The Athenians justify their conquest by claiming that the Melians would do the same if they were the strong. So if the roles were completely reversed, if the Melians were the strong ones, they would come into Athens, they would dominate them, and the Athenians would be dominated. It's a complete dog eat dog world mindset. If you're not going to go in and conquer because you're the strong, then someone else is going to come and dominate you. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so jumping into torture. It's a little bit different. We're kind of jumping from topic to topic here. So in regards to torture, we began with the premise of Mahamadou Slahi and his experience being in prison for 14 years in Guantanamo Bay. Donald, I think it's Rumsfeld, he was the Secretary of Defense under Bush. He approved of specific interrogation techniques. We made a huge list in class of what these interrogation techniques were: sleep deprivation, rape. He wasn't allowed to practice his religious beliefs. He was forced to eat during Ramadan. He was beaten. He was kept in freezing cold temperatures, sensory deprivation, and the guards basically took full advantage of him when he was in the psychological distress. So, pretty inhumane, awful things happened to him. And then we find out later there was no evidence that Mahamadou was related to 9/11. The Bush administration had kind of created this profile that Mahamadou was he was a former member of Al Qaeda. He reported later that he joined it, he left it, but essentially they had information that he was a member of Al Qaeda, and so they took this and they imprisoned him. They used that against him, and so I at the bottom here said that his interrogation was torture. The administration at the time basically tried to justify their defenses as interrogation techniques that were used against him. They weren't effective. We learned that, or Mahamadou in his own account described how he basically just gave information that they wanted to hear. He lied to them. Ultimately, he claims his innocence, and so he had nothing to report. And so starting with this kind of this premise for torture, I think raises a lot of questions, but I also think it really appeals to our ethos. We're very compassionate towards Mahamadou, and this is obviously one of the most this is a horrific example of what can happen when torture is done wrongly. And not to say that torture is okay, but this is kind of what leads into Mark Bowden's point, that torture, it's not impermissible. In the case of Mahamadou, yeah, it was horrible, it was horrifying, and it certainly shouldn't have happened the way it did. But there are some circumstances, according to Mark Bowden, that torture is necessary. But he has a pretty interesting point in that it should be illegal. So it kind of seems a little bit contradictory that torture is not impermissible, but it should be illegal. I don't know. Do you guys have thoughts about that or questions about that statement? Oops. So I don't know, a common question in our class, is how can you encourage something to be illegal, but still think it's okay to do? And Mark Bowden gives a lot of different reasons for why he gives this very specific stance. First, he's not saying that torture should be done in every situation. And that's, essentially why it should be illegal. Torture should be a very last case scenario after every other option has been exhausted. So, there has been, I don't know, Mark Bowden would think that maybe in some circumstances torture has worked in the past. And so he thinks that under very, very certain circumstances, it could work again. So I said number 2 here. If an individual has information that could save lives and torture was the only action to extract the information, then it is permissible to torture the individual. The consequences for torturing someone should be so severe that the situation must be absolutely necessary in order to torture someone. So that's kind of where essentially the idea of becoming illegal but still not impermissible is, if it's absolutely necessary, it can save lives, then it really wouldn't matter too much what the consequences were for the individual who would enact torture. They'd be willing to do whatever it took to save millions of lives or thousands of lives, however many they think would come from the information that they can get from this individual. If it was legal, interrogators would pretty much always turn to torture before exhausting other options. Okay, maybe I said that a little bit strongly, but I think the idea is that if torture was an option at times, then it would be turned to because of its effectiveness, at least in the eyes of interrogators. They think, well, why would I waste my time trying to exhaust all these other options when I can just torture this person and get the information that we need to save lives? And that's not what Bowden wants, and that's not what he's trying to claim. He thinks it's possible in certain circumstances for it to happen, but if it was happening with every person we're interrogating, then we're, that's unethical, and that's on the stance. So Mark Bowden essentially is a utilitarian. He's essentially, his thought is that it's better to inflict pain on one individual so that more pain can be reduced. And I think he's pretty strict to this idea that he's willing to inflict pain on one individual if and only if he knows, or if we know that it's going to save more lives. And so, this is another trolley scenario. We were willing to sacrifice the one to save the 5. And I think that's what Mark Bowden is trying to get at with his argument. Any questions about Mark? Let's see, I got a chat question. Okay. So kind of coming to our final point, which we discussed in our most recent class, that was surveillance and whistleblowing. Honestly, this of all the topics of the semester, I think is one of my favorites to talk about. There's so many interesting ideas ethically about the idea of surveillance, and I think that's more of what we are inclined to talk about rather than whistleblowing, because surveillance, it affects every single one of us, very personally. We think about foreign intervention, we're very aware of some of the evil things that are happening, but the surveillance that occurs, from our smartphones, from information that they're gathering about our lives, that's very personal to us. And so, in my opinion, this could be a pretty fun topic to talk about. So I start with the idea of Edward Snowden, who we talked about. He was the whistleblower for the NSA. He leaked information about all the data mining and gathering that the NSA had on everybody. It was, I think it was speculation up until the point that he leaked it. But he exposed that the government had just, storage of everybody's lives, or of information on everybody and all the things that they did, the people that they talked to, their day-to-day activities. They had just storage facilities of all this information. And so his view, or his standpoint, is that it's the responsibility of the citizens to expose classified information that is corrupt. So I'm appealing here to the whistleblowing side of this scenario. So in the case of whistleblowing, it's the responsibility of the citizen to expose classified information. He leaks information to the New York Times about the surveillance the NSA conducts on all American citizens. He comes out publicly to advocate for privacy rights for individuals. In the U.S. government, if the U.S. government continues to gather the amount of information they have been, then they would be able to use this information against someone at any time. So this is essentially where Snowden's argument is rooted. He thinks it's the right of all individuals to be able to determine what privacy they have a right to. This being hidden from the public gives them absolutely no ability to have a say in what they can, what they can keep private and what could be exposed to the government. So he appealed to the Fourth Amendment, which essentially promises the rights of all individuals to not have any unlawful search and seizure. They can, they have a right to privacy. And so, yeah, I don't know, I blew through that one pretty quick, but if you guys want to have a little bit of a discussion, I'm curious, like, what were your guys' thoughts on privacy and surveillance? One thing I noticed is I think, and this is what I'm kind of, my intuitions are, is that, if I'm not doing anything bad, I don't really care too much if people have information on me. But I don't know, what do you guys have any thoughts on privacy and surveillance? Thoughts on what Snowden did? If you guys do, I'd love to talk about it. If not, that's okay.
I have kind of a comment on that.
Yeah.
If you, like, I feel like if I'm not doing anything wrong, like, you think you don't care about them, keeping information on you. But what happens if they find information that they think you've been talking to somebody that has done something wrong and they think you're connected in with it? What happens when you get pulled into that situation and you have nothing to do or no knowledge about it, and they have all suspicions of reasoning that you do because you communicate with that person?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, because I think in what Snowden's worry was is that, think of all the information they can gather about us now. In 20 years, think of how much more information they can store. They could have 20 years of our lives stored in, in hard drives or in cloud, based data mines, and any of that information could be turned on us at any time. The example you gave is, what if we're falsely accused? What if they twist the information that they've seen in the past to work against us? And I think that's a very legitimate concern. And I think Snowden's very right in saying that that's not going to be okay, because that's essentially what they're leading to. So I don't know. I should have let everyone else jump in, but what do you guys think about that?
As far as what I think Snowden did, I think he was right to expose the government like that, but I think he could have done it in a more classy fashion than the way that he did.
Okay. Yeah. No. How so? I think that was a common common take on it as well.
Well,
do you mind just sharing with us like how he exposed it? Because I never really went over that as well.
Yeah. Well, he just kind of, in the interview it said that he, most whistleblowers like to keep it on the down low who he is and who you are if you decide to expose something like that. And he didn't. He was very public about it, and his really only explanation is that the people deserve to know. But I don't really understand why he needs to have all the credit if the people are going to know regardless of whether they know Edward Snowden's name or not, right? But like Obama said in his speech, like, he doesn't think he's that patriotic, because if he really loved this country, he would go to court and he would face the consequences that might happen to him, instead of running to two countries that don't particularly have the best relationships with America, Russia, and China. So that's kind of a little, odd. But if, I guess if I was him, I would have, maybe told New York Times, but said like, don't drag me into it. You didn't hear it from me,
Yeah, I honestly, I think that's an excellent observation, because I don't know, to me it does seem a little bit fishy. I think maybe one thing, and I think part of his reasoning as well, as what he mentioned, is he hopes to speak to the credibility of what he's claiming by showing a face. But as you mentioned, if the evidence is strong enough, he really doesn't need to. And so I don't know, it is kind of fishy that he'd be willing to expose himself and then flee to two of our countries that we're very hostile with.
I have a kind of a comment about that, with like Obama and him saying that he had signed an executive order, previously, before Snowden came out and brought this, to the public, to research the NSA. Do you think that they would have done as intensive an interrogation, or like looking into the NSA, if Snowden wouldn't have come out with it to the public as strong? Like, or do you think they would have kept it more on the down low and, kind of just made more classified information to let the NSA continue what they were doing?
I think it's a great question. I don't know, does anyone want to jump in? Well, I think that's very, very realistic of a concern that Snowden had, is if he thinks that this is classified information that would never be revealed, that's more the reason for him to feel obligated to expose it. And then again, I think our political leaders, they always want us to hear what we want to hear. And so I don't know. I think that's a really interesting point. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I think to your question, I think that's exactly what Snowden would think is, if he did let this go through a democratically elected process where our leaders can choose what information to expose, after investigations into the problem. I don't know, why wasn't it happening before if that was the case? If it was an issue, or I guess it was under his administration that these things were continuing to occur. And so, what would Snowden need to reveal to him that he probably didn't already know that needed to be investigated? So, okay, so another question I think was common in class is, if perhaps if you are inclined to say, the government should have some level of surveillance on its people for protection for its citizens. And again, I don't know if any of you guys here have that stance, but just maybe for the sake of argument, if he did, what level of surveillance should they be allowed to have? Is it possible that they have too much right now? And I think some of us would agree that they do. But we also think of some of the things that they are able to stop because of the surveillance. Terrorist attacks is one of the common things we've talked about. But as well as, think of the FBI, who is able to catch predators online. They're able to take down drug trafficking rings, and all sorts of other illegal activity that happens specifically online. Edward Snowden, he's a huge advocate for Tor browsing, which is essentially private. It's a way to browse and to do things online privately. And it's a lot of things that are involved with Tor browsing is, child pornography rings, drug trafficking rings, paraphernalia, e-commerce sites. If you guys have heard of AlphaWay, It was one of the biggest e-commerce sites to ever take place on the dark web. They were netting $800,000 a day in selling drugs and other illegal, and other paraphernalia. And so some would argue that surveillance is able to, not wait until they have probable cause for certain people, but be able to kind of cut it at the core, find people who are involved in these type of things, putting people at risk because of their secret doings online. So I don't know, to some degree, like, do you guys think that the government should be able to surveil us in order to protect us from these type of things? Do you think it's impossible to find a balance? I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I'm of the position that the government surveilling us or whatever doesn't actually matter. I think the outcomes of what happens is what matters. The actual surveillance doesn't. So if there is like in class, the surveillance they get is mostly metadata. So it's not really like they're watching each person. They have select targets that they know, and those are who they would investigate. And we haven't seen otherwise. And the only time it would become a problem is if we do see otherwise.
Is it possible, and I might be kind of going way out of here, but is it possible that if this kind of information was not leaked to the public, if if American citizens had no say in privacy and surveillance, as it kind of was the case when these things were classified, do you think it could possibly get more intense with the kind of information that they're gathering on us? They were getting metadata in mass quantities, but again, Snowden kind of was worried that in the future they'd be able to gather way more information. They'd be able to gather, perhaps our, our day-to-day routines through, I don't know. I don't want to say through video cameras, because that seems a little crazy. Who knows if that, could happen? It's possible. But, do you think if these things weren't exposed, is it possible that these extremes could happen to the point where, the government had access to nearly everything that we did with the amount of technology that we have?
Yes, I completely think that would be an option. I think that it would probably spiral downhill when they were trying to investigate or find out, they have somebody that is, on their watch list, their target or whatever, and they don't have the right story, or they can't find the story, so they need to make one up, or they want to conceal the story that actually happened and make one up to give to the public. Like they could find a way to make connections through all the information that they save, to do that, to make up their own story. Just like Snowden was saying, is they, with all this information, they can piece together their own story and give it to the public, and the public's going to believe that more than likely over what one person or a little group of people are going to say.
I would say it happens regardless of whether or not the public knows or doesn't know. I mean, the Snowden leaked everything, and the surveillance just increased since then, just because people don't care that much about the actual surveillance.
I would argue that, regardless if Snowden said anything, I feel like the American people would find out eventually. Like, targeted ads on all of our social media is already so huge that, if they can, target us and sell us things, how come they can't target us and find out other information? So I think people would have found out about it one way or another, but I think what Snowden did just kind of lit the fire under it,
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's insane the kind of information that target marketing can do. And if you guys have heard the story about the couple, or it was a teenage girl who was pregnant, and she started getting ads for pregnancy, for babies and for newborn stuff, maternity stuff, and she got all this information before she even knew she was pregnant. So I mean, you can kind of say it's a coincidence, but they have incredible skills in being able to get very personal information just based off of geographical information, based off of our buying purchases. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. Like, regardless, I think that's the point we're moving towards. You know, even in 2013, when after Edward Snowden has, you know, worked on this huge project, it seems like it's only increased. So I don't know. So I guess like the major question is, you know, they can do these things. We know that they can do these things. Should they be doing these things? You know, should laws be enacted to secure the privacy of individuals? I mentioned Tor browsing, and you know, I'm not advocating for this either way, but Tor browsing is not illegal. In spite of the things that it's associated with and what can result from it, it's not illegal. So people can Tor privately, or they can browse privately. You know, we have cryptocurrencies which allow people to buy things privately. So people, you know, are also becoming a lot more able to do things under the radar to avoid these type of things. But I don't know. I guess like that's the main question then is should they, you know, what should we allow the government to do if they are going to keep doing it anyways? You know, I don't know, what should we do? What's the ethical position that we should take on that?
I don't think that there's any way to stop it. You know, there's no way to really get control of it. And you can enact laws and everything, but it's just like the idea of torture or things like that, where the government is above the law. You know, they might make the law, but they're still above it. And so would they really follow it? Would they justify reasons to break that law or not obey it, you know, or, you know, be able to just say, oh yeah, we are doing it, but you know, behind the scenes they got a third party company that's doing it for them.
I think the company point is good because I think we're focused too much on the government when in reality the government's getting all the information from internet companies. They have deals with Verizon, AT&T. They have deals with all those people. It's not the government themselves, it's the private entities that's selling the data and helping the government. It's not just the government.
Right. That's very true. And I think we focus a lot on this specific scenario because of Edward Snowden. But you know, you're completely right. I think the corporations who gather our information to market to us, you know, gain incredible amounts of information. And it's definitely, I don't know, it's definitely interesting to think about. I'm gonna have to kind of cut this because I promised everyone that I have a Kahoot with test questions that are gonna be similar to what you'd see on the test. But one thing I think maybe as a closing remark to this discussion, you know, if I don't know, I just think you know, it's an interesting topic because we may not think about it too often, but it does occur to us. And so, you know, these individuals who are being accused because of information that has been gathered years in the past, you know, is it justified for our legal law system to be able to use that information to persecute them? And again, as you know, Jacob, sorry, I was trying to get your name. As Jacob has mentioned, you know, if it's wrongfully accused, then you know, it could lead to a lot more. It could lead to more bad in some cases. Anyways, so let me pull up Kahoot. So if you guys want to join in this, I think this is a really beneficial thing as part of SI. I love doing Kahoots when I go to SI sessions. So just go to kahoot.it either on your computer or on your smartphones. Let me pull my screen up here. I'll try to keep this until 9. You know, you guys are by no means required to stay past 9. I know it's only supposed to be an hour, so you're welcome to stay so you can get all the questions if you want. I'll try to go through them quick so you don't have to stay too late though.
I'm sorry, what website is it? Just Kahoot.com? Or Kahoot?
So yeah, so you'll just go to kahoot.it. We posted it in the chat, and then it'll say join, and then there's this code, the 366131. That's what you'll type in. Let me, all right, let's do it. Okay, sweet. I had to throw that in there. Again, I know this is a huge chunk of your grade, and so I hate for you guys to miss any points for something as simple as sending me an email with somebody you vote for. So I'm glad you guys all got that. Okay, so right away, my question or this answer completely contradicts itself. That was a mistake. It's supposed to say, no, we had no plan to help Libya stabilize after this overthrow. So again, that's Stephen Kinzer's main position is, if we're leaving these countries worse off than they were before we intervened, then we shouldn't have intervened in the first place. And so he would take the stance, if it's absolutely necessary for us to overthrow these leaders, we need to have a plan in place to help these countries stabilize. And so the answer, yes, although intervention isn't always good, it is this time. I think he would say no. He didn't think that this was a good idea. I think it may be true that at times he does think it's good to intervene. He thought this was a really bad idea, and it was a really bad example of U.S. intervention because of the state that the U.S. left Libya in. So again, I'm really sorry about the wording of that answer. That was my bad. But do you guys have any questions about that? All right. Okay, perfect. This was a little bit more of a tricky question. Yeah, so you might see a question like this on the test. Maybe this one specifically, just because Dr. Ottoson really wants to know if you guys have done the readings, and so this is a pretty important factual information so that you can understand the arguments that Stephen Kinzer was making. He thought that as these migrants were coming and trying to enter the U.S., he would say something along the lines of, well, we should be letting them in because we were the ones that caused all the problems for them in the first place. It was the U.S.'s doing that caused these death squads to come in and take down these people, and for these political leaders to become, these corrupt political leaders to come into power. It was directly because it directly correlated with the U.S. involvement, specifically this destabilizing coup that was established by the Obama administration in 2009. So if you have questions about like this, I would certainly go back to the article, maybe just do a quick peruse through it. Again, these kind of facts aren't like, oh, okay, did you study hours and hours on this paper? No, it's more of like, did you get the general idea of papers? Okay, so this is a kind of a tricky question. So the Athenians and Robert Kaplan support the idea of empires. That's definitely true, but their reasoning behind why empires are necessary are completely different. Robert Kaplan supports the idea that with empires, there's stability, there's order, and it's better off for all of the people involved. The Athenians, however, they think empires are necessary, or maybe not just necessary, they happen because there's stronger nations and there's weaker ones. And the stronger ones will always destroy and dominate the weak ones. And so Robert Kaplan has a much more, I think he has a much more realistic idea of empires, or an idealistic idea of empires, something that we'd want from them. The Athenians, it's their idea is it's dog eat dog world. Empires come in to dominate and destroy the weak. So, okay, since we had a few missed that, did you guys have questions about that? All right, let's try to keep going through these. Okay, so again, I could see why why this question might have been confusing. Going back to the previous question about Kinzer's response to the overthrow of Gaddafi, he thought that specific situation was bad, and that was because of the instability that was caused in Libya after. So yeah, he thought that was bad. He probably would have disagreed with the U.S. government's decision to do it before they did it, just because they had no plan to restabilize the nation afterwards. And so I think it's important to understand Kinzer's ethical view of foreign intervention is not necessarily that it's always 100% wrong. It's usually not good. And I guess that's kind of where you have to watch these type of questions. If they're absolute answers, it's usually not an absolute answer. Most people don't take an absolute decision or defense. But if it were absolutely necessary for us to overthrow a government that is corrupt, he would encourage it as long as the U.S. has some sort of plan to restabilize the nation afterwards, so that the people aren't left in ruins. Okay, so blue is obviously right, or no, sorry, this is where it gets confusing. So yeah, so blue isn't right just because that's Stephen Kinzer's position. So it's important to understand the difference. I just tripped myself up, so I totally understand why that was confusing. But Robert Kaplan, he believes in empires, and he also believes that intervention is necessary. because without them, there is instability and chaos. So yeah, I totally understand the confusion on that, but you just got to be aware of the different figures and their ethical views. Robert Kaplan and Stephen Kinzer, they had two completely different views. Okay, perfect. Good job. Okay, perfect. I was just rereading my question. It sounds a little weird, but you guys all got it right, so good job. Perfect. Yeah, 14 years of misery. It's an incredible number. But yeah, good job on that one. Okay, perfect. So this is one of those questions where you got to really read the answer. It is true that he was a member of Al-Qaeda, but he was not a member of Al-Qaeda when he was arrested. He was at one point a member and he meddled with it for a little bit, but he describes how he left it pretty quickly. And so at the time of his arrest, no, he wasn't a member of Al-Qaeda, but they looked at that, and that's important to know because they used that against him. They used the fact that he had ties with Al-Qaeda to assume or to suspect that he had some sort of involvement with 9/11. Perfect. Yep, that's true. And again, I think Dr. Otteson brought up one of the most interesting questions to think about when we think about torture. I think maybe some of us would be inclined to think that, if the circumstance is present, that we know we can get information from a person, we have to do whatever means necessary to get that information to save more lives. And Dr. Otteson brought up the example of what would it be permissible to maybe torture their children in order to extract that information? And I think that's definitely something worth thinking about. I don't know. That's a tough one. That's a really hard question. I hope I would sure hope I would never have to be in a position to make that decision, because I would definitely probably not do it. But from a utilitarian standpoint, you have to think what's going to save the most lives possible. And is sacrificing and inflicting pain on certain people worth it to save the lives of thousands, of thousands of people? So I don't know, just something to think about. Good job, you guys got that right. I think we've got about 4 more questions and we're a little over on time. Perfect. He works at NSA. Perfect. Yep. I think both of those are correct. He kind of, I don't know, we mentioned in class, he kind of gives like a roundabout answer for it. But I think both of those are correct. Perfect. Deontology is again concerned with, it's concerned with absolutes, and it's also concerned with this principle of humanity, where you can never use someone as a mere means to an end to satisfy some other purpose. Perfect. Yeah, utilitarianism, just because you'd be willing to inflict pain on somebody if absolutely necessary to save the lives of thousands of people. Okay, everybody, well done. I mentioned this in the last SI session. These questions are definitely, they're challenging questions. I wouldn't expect, I wouldn't expect anyone to get 100% on any of these. And I think it's important to know that some of the questions you're going to see on the test are also going to be pretty rigorous and challenging. And that's not because, necessarily, we can talk about someone wants everyone to get a bad grade. If a curbing is necessary, he's usually very accommodating to that. But with COVID, you can never, I guess the goal of these questions is to make sure that you can't Google the answers easily. So just keep in mind, it is going to require that you've done the readings, that you participated in class, and that you understand the arguments behind all of these moral theories that we've discussed. So with that in mind, if you guys have any questions, I'll stick around for a little bit. Thanks for staying a little bit late. Sorry about the confusion with the Zoom link. But yeah, I appreciate you guys all staying. I think you guys had a really good discussion today, and you guys did really well in the Kahoot. So you guys are going to do well on the test.
Thank you.
Is the test proctored?
No, it's not. I think, I don't think it is.
Okay, sweet. I was just curious. I just don't like staring at the computer and not being able to just like relax and think,
Yeah, no, I feel you. I think you're good. The only thing you got to keep in mind is it's 50 minutes, so it's not like you're going to be able to. It's open book, open note. Dr. Artisan actually has said that and encouraged that, but you're not going to be able to look up every single answer. So.
Oh, sweet. Then that's good, because I feel like I'm understanding most of the concepts pretty well, and like the stories, it's just kind of like going to be like, what's this name, what's his story, who wrote, just keeping those all straight is my biggest thing.
For sure. I mean, in 6 weeks, and we'll have one more week of coverage before the test, we've talked about upwards of 12 15 people, so it's hard to keep their names straight. So yeah, I can't remember if it was you or if it was another student who asked about the study guide. When I created the study guide last semester, I tried to pick every single person we talked about and just write their argument and their ethical position. I think that could be a pretty good study guide for the test, something that you can have with you to reference, like, what is this person's name, what did this person believe, so you don't get it mixed up.
Okay, awesome. Sweet, thank you.
Cool.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Are we working under the assumption that it's implied that we have a moral right to privacy for the whole Edward Snowden and everything? It's no matter what, we have a moral right to privacy, and that's why it would be ethical or unethical if someone surveilled us.
I think that's a good question. I think some would argue yes. Some would argue that it is at least under constitutional rights that we have privacy. But I don't know. I think we may think that, but we're also very willing to sacrifice and expose all of our information pretty freely. Yeah, any terms and agreements that you sign, or any website you go onto that says this website uses cookies, will you accept? If you accept it, then you are willing to sacrifice some of your privacy. So yeah, sorry, for your specific question, I think that's what Edward Snowden would think, is that he is acting under the implication that we do have a right to privacy, at least a certain amount of privacy, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it was more of like what the class is working with, not because I think that's beyond the scope of, I guess, this one.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, yeah, and I think Edward Snowden would say we do have implicit rights towards privacy, and that's probably where the basis of his whole argument comes from.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Josh, I found it kind of interesting how when you brought up like the